As I reached the magic portal itself, I realized that will be the first time I've went across the mirror since I first crossed a few days ago. It gave me time to look in my wounds to make a call. Of course, making a call nowadays is a bit different than it used to be. After just a little bit of time, I was able to get everything I needed to continue. The look of diving equipment must have been very strange to the elves as I took it back into the cave. A few followed, I'm guessing out of sheer curiosity, and watched as I stripped down to get in my wetsuit. The air was cold, and the water was even worse. It wouldn't suit anyone if I got a case of hypothermia, so I made sure everything was ready. Once I checked my equipment, I handed off the end of my 550 paracord to my friend so that he could tie it to something solid. I would be drifting downstream and need a way back in case the current got a little strong. After climbing into the water, I got my fins on and it was time to do some searching. Once under the water, I could get a good look. There was only about 20 feet or so from the inner dungeon wall to the outer edge. Slowly, I lowered myself, letting the current pull me. Since I am not certified as a cave diver, I went very slow, making sure that I did not catch my equipment on rocks or anything else on the way by. The water, though moving fairly fast, was remarkably clear. It was clear enough that it wasn't runoff from the supposed castle. I could even see a few fish in it, actually. Trying to stay as close to the center and as deep as possible, I could see myself start to come up to the daylight. It had to be around noon because the light shimmering in made everything sparkle in an almost blinding refraction. As my head finally passed out into the open, I suddenly felt a massive pain in my leg. As I recoiled in pain, I could feel it pull me upwards in the same area. Then there was a pain on the right side, and I could tell I'd just been slashed. As I thrashed around, I could see a bunch of spear tips coming down into the water. Those bastards must have been waiting here, just like that jerk said. The spear in my leg began to pull me up closer to the others. It must have been longer than the others that just kept jabbing at me, but never actually reaching down far enough. As it pulled, I kept getting closer and closer to the spears coming down at me. If I got any closer, the rest of the spears would perforate me and then drag me straight to the top. Suddenly, another long spear came down and hit my spare air tank. This one is kept up as a backup just in case my main tank fails. It's a small, separate tank on the front of my torso. The resulting explosion of air catapulted my torso to the bottom of the river. This made me hit the main tank on the river's floor. Thankfully, it didn't rupture. If it had, a really bad day would have been turned into probably my last day real fast. That is when I started going back up. The spear was still embedded into my calf muscle as I was being dragged to the surface. As I started to rise, I could see the other spears pulsating down into the water. There was no way to stop myself from being pulled into it at this range. I simply closed my eyes and waited. Didn't have to wait too long, though, as the 550 cord suddenly pulled me back upstream violently. As it did, the pain in my leg became excruciating as the spear twisted. I looked down, if down compared to where I was facing, and could see that those that had a grip on the spear had been pulled into the river. With that, my friend and his elf helpers pulled me back up out of the river. He immediately started working on my leg as I tried to get the scuba gear off. After a quick look, he said, "It's not going to come out easy." I grabbed onto the closest thing I could and waited. The elves I grabbed didn't know why I was suddenly holding onto them so tight, and the look of confusion until my friend moved the spear in position and broke it off with a good solid kick. I don't care who you are, no one could blame me for screaming at that. He could then pull the shaft out easily. He had to sew me up right then and there, and I'll admit a few tears came out. As he did, one of the elves picked up the end of the spear and showed it to the others. Not sure what they said, but they were clearly not happy. Eventually, I motioned to one of them in a way that said, "What?" Through hand motions, they showed that it's the metal used by either toxic to elves or some sort of tranquilizing effect in it. I couldn't quite tell which, though they seemed to hold it all right without it affecting them. At that point, I was more concerned with limping back to the mirror to get some of my antibiotics. The elves helped me back, and I had to calm my brothers down when they saw me bandaged on the way I was. I told them that I would have to try again some other time. This time, I wouldn't go back through the mirror. I stayed and got treated by the elves. They did some of that strange healing thing they did. It didn't look any different from what I saw before, but the feeling, that was weird. The pain, the excruciating pain, slowly disappeared as I could feel the nerve endings reattach themselves, the muscle reconnect, and the skin slowly mend. It only took a couple of minutes before I was back up on my feet, but I was still amazed at the feeling of the healing. While I was laying down from them to fix my leg, two of them looked up and moved higher on my body. I didn't know what they were doing until I could see the same energy radiating across my entire body. I didn't know what they did, but I suddenly felt better than I have in several years. When I stood up, my knees didn't hurt anymore, and my lost hearing was back. I thought that was until I started coughing hard. I could feel something moving around inside my lungs. I dropped on my knees and started to wheeze and cough painfully. I could hear air in all right, but it came out in violent and chunky. One of the elves got behind me and slapped me on the back several times. They must have loosened something because one solid cough, almost vomit, and a bunch of black congealed goop sprayed out of my mouth and ended up on the floor. I still had to get some of it out, but the majority of it came out in one go. By the way, it tasted several dozen levels of nasty. Rising back up, I could suddenly breathe better than I could remember. Taking a deep breath in, my head cleared and I could finally assess what just happened. I looked at the pile of black goo as my friend checked me out. He looked at the goop as well and asked, "Are you think what I'm thinking?" I just answered him, "Fucking burn pits." An hour later, I'm getting ready to go upstream. This time, if I get in trouble, all I'd have to do is drift back to the starting point. As I go under, I know that the light is not nearly as strong. There's at least 100 feet of tunnel before I get to the exterior this time. As I climb along the bottom, it is clear that there will be no way to get the elves out this way unless I brought them one at a time. If this was going downstream, they could just hold their breath and swim hard, but upstream, with no places to stop to take a breath, not going to happen. I have to use my flashlight about halfway, at least I thought it was halfway to the end. Not being cave certified, I couldn't really estimate how dangerous what I was doing. It wasn't too long before I realized that I was out of the cave. Surfacing, I suddenly wished that I had my rifle with me. I looked around and tried to be as quiet as possible as I got a good look around, took off my fins, and began to take my surroundings in. Unlike the other side, there was no guards or persons of any kind. I did scare a couple small animals, but that was about it. I started looking at the flora and noticed how colorful it was. Even in the moonlight, I could see how colorful the creatures as the elves could hide in. Walking around the spur that kicked me out, about 90 degrees from the river, I could see that there was a fire. I snuck around to see what was going on. From behind the bushes, I could see the group that had tried to kill me with spears. While a few kept watch on the river, the rest of them ate and drank around the fire. Even saw one of them had either brought their wife or a prostitute to the party. It wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for what else I saw. Now, I had to look up some of this, so bear with me. Though the ones in armor were mostly human, they had a few lizard men and a single one of those troll guys, like the ones we killed in the dungeon that first day. Though one of the females was human, the rest were halflings, lizard females, even elves, and even what seems like some sort of beastkin, however you say that, all of which were in some level of chains. That, I was guessing, was to remind them that they were servants. Instinctively, I reached for my dive knife, but I had to stop myself. Though I knew what was going to happen, I couldn't risk the operation. I couldn't think of a more difficult decision to make in that point in my life. Shaking, not only from the excitement, but from the cold, I went back to the cave opening and tied the end of the paracord to the tree near its base. Since it is green, it would be difficult to see and easy to make my way back upstream. Before I left, I pulled out my cell phone. I had it double wrapped in plastic bags and got a few pictures of the camp. I was so angry at what I saw that I didn't even want to talk when I got back, though my little brother had the biggest shit-eating grin on his face. He confidently said, "I've got it." I looked confused and asked, "What do you got?" He showed a book and said, "I have a way to communicate with him now." He had a brilliant idea of getting a book that translated Elvish to English. At first I thought, no way is that possible. After a long discussion, he demonstrated that it worked. We figured that someone must have come across a long time ago and figured out their language. Guess the truth is stranger than fiction, after all. The symbols the elves used were not exactly right, in fact only about 70% accurate. It was enough to get us started, though. Speaking of getting started, I have friends arriving. Time to get this show moving. My brothers take turns looking after the elves as my friend and I go to meet our longtime associates. Despite what you think, there wasn't much alcohol involved. For most of us, our heavy drinking days are long past. I did make sure that there was a bunch of food was delivered, though. As things began to settle down and the tone shifted, you see, I had sent out an emergency code to them. This made sure that they all knew to bring whatever materials, toys, tools they would need because one of us was in kind of deep. This isn't the first time that this has happened, but the group was much smaller from now on. Usually guys didn't show up due to family responsibilities or something like that. No one had an issue at this point. I sat them all down in the living room and told them that I'd gotten mixed up in some traffickers. Though I called them that is what they really are, slave traders. And I wanted to at least get one group free of them. They all looked a bit confused considering we were located in the country. They called it a flyover state for a reason, after all. I had to make sure they were ready for what was coming, so I asked my friend to retrieve a few of the refugees while I spilled it all out. I told them about the house, the mirror, the jewelry, all of it. I got a few eye rolls right off the bat, but eventually most of them started coming around. A few still didn't believe me until my friend walked in the room with an adult male, female, and young child elf. 2 were red, and the third was a lighter purple or almost pink. Most of them stood up at the sight of the elves. With this motion, the young one clutched tightly to my friend's leg in fear of all the men in the room looking at her. I said, "I have already come up with a plan, though if there are any ways that any of you can improve it, I'm all ears." A couple chuckles came out since the elves all had the long ears that humans do. I continued, "Though I do have to tell you that if you join me, it will probably turn into a one-way trip." I paused for a moment to make sure that phrase went over right. "If you're in, meet me in the dining room."